Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight I'm going to do the last of my videos with the theme English Civil War. So if you remember the other day I did a little talk using my little toy soldiers about the infantry and how they would fight in the English Civil War. In other words, the musketeers pouring out the fire, and then the pikemen going it pushing the enemy away. That's pretty much the tactics for the infantry. And then last night we did a video looking at the cavalry, the horse, the mounted troops on the battlefield, and I explained how the tactics change from predominantly using firearms, retreating, reloading, charging, retreating, reloading, to the standard tactic that took off for the latter era of the Civil War and into the 18th century, where firearms were discharged and swords were used as the main weapon. However, within an English Civil War battlefield, you don't just have the infantry and the cavalry, you also have the artillery, the gunners, the big guns, the cannons on the battlefield. And if we were looking at a battle, and like I said, if you look at some of the engravings of battles such as the Battle of Naseby, you will see how the infantry take up the bulk of the space on the battlefield in the middle. And then usually high up on the wings are the bodies of horse who could then sweep down and clear the battlefield whilst the infantry fight it out. The artillery are interesting in their own right, and just like we have Barif and De Gen, there are also period booklets and manuals that we can use. This one is a copy of the Gunner's Class, and as it suggests, it is a gunnery class. It's a gunnery school, a gunnery pamphlet, a gunnery manual, and it has all sorts in here, everything on how to load a gun, how to fire the gun. But my favourite bit is all about how the gun was aimed during battle, and it is a very technical process. The actual aiming process was very technical. A gun captain, a man who had his own gun and was in charge of it, had to know a number of things, including mathematics. He also had to know things like geometry and also trigonometry. It was very important to get the angles correct to make sure that the cannon shot went where you wanted it to go, really. It wasn't just a case of blasting away in a battle. So this manual has everything in it. So as I always say, when people ask, how do you know a pike was used like that? How do you know the cavalry worked like that? How do you know artillery were trained in mathematics, in trigonometry? It's all in period pamphlets and manuals. It's so important to look at primary sources. It really is. So I've got toy soldiers out again. This is the last of my toy soldiers for the Civil War era. We've looked at the infantry. You saw my 25mm infantry, pike and musket. You saw my 25mm sized cavalry. I have now laid out for you some artillery. Once again, these are very old figures. I painted them when I was about 16, so ignore the fact that they are quite flashy as royalist artillery. Yes, they have wide-brimmed hats. Yes, they have very lacy collars and also ostrich feathers. So I do apologise. Do not look at what they're wearing. Just listen to what I say and see how I explain the tactics with the artillery. So we'll pan down, and the first two things I want you to look at is the two guns, very different guns, that are laid on the table. On this side here we have a field gun, your standard field gun at the time of the Civil War, and then on the right hand side here we have what is known as a mortar. They are two very distinct weapons. So if we take the field gun to start with, this is a bog standard field gun of average size, I would say. Guns generally went in three sizes. There are many different types of gun, but they generally sit in three categories. Small cannons will fire a cannonball about a pound in weight. Small cannons are usually called things like robinettes. They're nothing more than a big version of a musket on wheels, and fires a cannonball, if I use a comparison, about the same size as a ping pong ball, or maybe a snooker ball. It's a small cannon. You get sakers. Sakers are generally the halfway point, medium guns. They fire cannonballs the size of a bowling ball, a small bowling ball for grass or lawn bowls, by the way. And they weigh about £6 in weight. The larger guns that you can get in the Civil War were guns such as cannon royales, and these were big guns. These were big siege guns that were capable of firing a £60 cannonball, which is pretty much the size of a car tyre, if not bigger than that. They're huge guns. But field guns, as the name suggests, are generally the smaller guns, the robinets, the sakers, the falconets, and so on. And they look like this. These guns were always on a wooden carriage to enable them to be moved around. They also came with a limber to allow them to be moved by oxen or horses. Very rarely would they manhandle the things. And the barrels themselves were usually cast out of solid bronze. Some of the barrels were also made out of iron. There was also, especially at the time of the Battle of Worcester, they were actually using cannons known as leather cannons, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. They are very thin iron cast barrels, usually supported with rope going all the way around the ironwork to hold the iron together, basically. And then it was stitched into a leather casing. Which are very unusual guns, very much a Scottish thing. And what you have to remember is during the Battle of Worcester, the Royalists had a predominantly Scottish army. Some of these leather guns actually had multiple barrels as well, so you'd have the carriage with, let's say, 3 or even 4 gun barrels laid alongside each other, so very much firing 4 barrels almost simultaneously. But the gun is only part of it. Just like I said, there's also the limber and then all the tools for its maintenance and firing. And one gun would have a number of people on it. I've only got a few characters here. There was sometimes more, sometimes less. But the loading process took a very long time. So the barrel had to be scraped out using a worm. It had to be wet mopped. It had to be dry mopped to ensure there was nothing burning in there. It then had ladles of powder or sometimes pre-made linen bags with the charges placed in. Wadding, cannonball, more wadding, all rammed home with a rammer, and then it was fired from a touch hole because these guns are all muzzle loading, so everything that you put in, including the tools for its maintenance, has to go through the muzzle end. It was fired by touching some powder that was in a touch hole at the bottom of the gun at this end. No guns were breech loaders really in the Civil War, but we do have evidence for breech loaders in the medieval period, and then obviously by the Victorian era, guns are all loaded from the breech end. So this is one field gun being loaded up with these characters all involved in its maintenance, loading and firing. The gun captain usually owned the gun, and they were very much mercenary type people. They were quite happy selling their services to whichever side paid the most. But that's the field gun. On this edge here, we've got a mortar. Now, a mortar was very different. Whereas a cannon fired very low, in other words, the ball, for example, came out of it and it travelled at a low trajectory, the idea of the mortar was it would fire up and over. So these are very much used in siege conditions where you want the shot to go up and over the enemy rampart. So that's the mortar. They are very different guns. Very rarely used in the field of battle, mainly used in siege warfare. And it's worth noting here that field guns are not that good in field conditions. They're better in sieges when you're blasting holes into castle walls and into forts, for example. On the battlefield, they're not the greatest things. They're more psychological than anything, purely because you are firing a thing that's louder than anything anyone had ever heard. If you think of the time, the 17th century, the loudest thing in life is in fact thunder, and obviously it's lightning. So when it came to the roar of gunpowder, it was an absolutely terrifying thing. Now, what I've got at the back here is a battery of guns. We've only got 3 guns here. They were arranged in a battery, which is something that continues afterwards, and they were lined up. and these would be pouring cannon shot into the enemy ranks. And what you have to remember, if you think back to the cavalry and the infantry, everyone was very close together. The idea is the cannonballs will fly in a direct line and tear through the ranks, tearing arms, legs, and even heads off the opposition. When the enemy gets very, very close, gunners can change to a new type of shot, and that was something known as grape shot. This was usually a bag sewn together with musket balls in, nails, broken pottery, bits of flint, pebbles, anything that you want really, scrap. And the thing is, when you fire that at point blank range, the bag splits open and you are spraying the enemy at point blank range with musket balls and rubbish. In theory, it acts like a shotgun. You will do a vast amount of damage to your enemy if your gunners are brave enough to stand there and fight. But the artillery, just like the cavalry and the infantry, all had to work together. So if I was a general and I was commanding the battle, I would make sure I softened the enemy up with artillery fire, put the fear into them, seeing their friends getting torn apart by iron shot. Also the roar, the deafening roar, and the smoke and the belching of the flames from the barrels. Psychologically, that will terrify your enemy, especially new recruits. And then I may send in my cavalry to wipe out the enemy cavalry. That's if I was the general, and then bring forward the infantry to fight it out. Hopefully, if my cavalry hasn't disappeared to the nearest baggage train or pub, they would then be brought back, and hopefully my infantry have won the day. The artillery will finish off what's left, and my cavalry will hunt down those that are fleeing the field of battle. And that is pretty much 17th century warfare. Artillery, cavalry and infantry. If you want to look at any other topics military history wise, maybe you want to see how Romans fight, maybe how the medieval person fought, or even some overseas or foreign history, because we do actually cover ancient Greece and ancient Egypt as well, we would be very happy doing another video on that. However, hopefully you've enjoyed this. Definitely comment, definitely share it away on Facebook and Twitter. Stay safe, and I hear a rumour that Helen could be back tomorrow giving you something not Civil War related at last. Anyway, on that note, stay safe and see you soon. Bye bye.